event today. Quick rundown of how the next hour will go. I'll start us off with some context and background on CrowdTangle, what the tool is, and highlight why it matters during this exceptionally crucial time. And then I'll turn it over to Senator Chris Coons to share some thoughts on this topic with us. And following his remarks, we'll be joined by an all-star panel of experts and then save a few minutes for audience questions towards the end. Please utilize the Q&A feature in your Zoom to participate. And finally, captioning is available by clicking the captioning button at the bottom of your screen in Zoom. Thank you again. So some background, CrowdTangle was acquired by Meta in 2016 and is a transparency tool that provides researchers, academics, and members of civil society concrete tactical ways to understand content and trends across Meta's platforms. It offers key insights into the engagement of public content and profiles, viral posts and media, and trends based on keywords, and historically has helped external parties hold the company accountable and conduct important third-party research. Ahead of the 2020 election in the US, Meta even gave access to election officials and secretaries of state in all 50 US states to conduct crucial election monitoring and mitigate the risk of online and offline harm. However, Meta has long been dissatisfied with the level of insight and detail that CrowdTangle provides. For example, in 2020, in response to New York Times journalist Kevin Roos's top 10 Facebook posts daily tweet thread pulled entirely from CrowdTangle data, the company created and published counter lists to distract journalists and researchers from their own tool. It has long been rumored that Meta planned to shut down the tool, or at minimum, restrict access to it. In March of this year, a quarter of the way through our so-called year of elections, Meta announced it would sunset CrowdTangle. After the announcement, more than 230 organizations, including the Center for American Progress, called on them to delay the shutdown until after the US election and simultaneously to improve the planned replacement, the Meta Content Library. Just last month, Senator Coons led an effort where 17 members of Congress co-authored a letter to Meta asking them to delay the shutdown and provide information about the suitability of the content library as a replacement. Notably, just mere hours ago, Senator Coons' office did receive a reply to the letter, but unsurprisingly, it does not answer any of the letter's questions and makes once again clear that Meta will proceed with the end of access to CrowdTangle as planned, despite a bipartisan and bicameral support for an extension. So, mere weeks before their elections earlier this summer, similarly, the European Commission opened formal proceedings against Meta for suspected infringements under the European Union's Digital Services Act, including the planned shutdown of CrowdTangle. In practice, Meta's live display dashboards prove insufficient, and researchers are struggling with the limited access and functionality of the content library ahead of the shutdown. And so today, in just 48 hours, Meta will renege on promises of transparency, information integrity, and accountability, just in time for critical and likely contentious US presidential elections right here at home. Now, I'll turn it over to Senator Chris Coons for some remarks.
Hi, I'm U.S. Senator Chris Coons. Every day, billions of human interactions happen on social media, yet we have almost no data, no genuine insights into how those interactions impact individuals or our society. It's shocking to me that we don't really have access to or an understanding of how the algorithms that drive social media affect us, our children, our families, and our country. That's why I led the bipartisan Platform Accountability and Transparency Act, or PATA, to require social media platforms to be more transparent and allow independent researchers to study what's happening. Senator Bill Cassidy and I, as well as 15 other members of Congress, wrote a letter recently to urge Meta to postpone its end of access for CrowdTangle, a powerful social media transparency tool that's allowed researchers and journalists to study election misinformation, foreign interference, mental health, and much more. I'm concerned Meta is taking this action weeks before an election in which the very heart of our democracy is at stake. I hope Meta will reconsider, but we shouldn't have to rely on the good graces of a tech giant to do the right thing. That's why Congress should take up and pass PATA. Thank you to the Center for American Progress for hosting today's event. Thank you to the panelists and to those of you in the research community and civil society who seek to understand platform behavior. I do this work so I can support you and your work. The idea of PATA is simple. Facts matter. Research and evidence matter. This should not be controversial or partisan. With your help, I remain hopeful Congress will act so we can all better understand the platforms that are so important to how we live our lives and to the future of our nation.
I'm joined today by a panel of experts who will deep dive into the importance of CrowdTangle to journalists, researchers, and academics who are independent from Meta, and the implication of CrowdTangle's loss on efforts to promote election integrity and reduce hate speech, misinformation, and political violence. First, we have Davey Alba. Davey is a technology reporter for Bloomberg and has previously reported on online disinformation, artificial intelligence, and technology's invasive effects for the New York Times, BuzzFeed News, and Wired. Davey has used CrowdTangle in her reporting for many years and has reported specifically on Meta's decision to pull support of CrowdTangle. Brandy Gerkink is the executive director of the Coalition for Independent Tech Research. Previously, Brandy was a senior fellow at the Mozilla Foundation, where she created the world's largest community-driven audit of YouTube's recommendation algorithms, called YouTube Regrets. She has criticized Meta's decision to shut down CrowdTangle during the 2024 global election year and irresponsible and undermining democracy. Third, we have Nathan Doctor. He is a senior digital methods manager at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue and previously led research into mis and disinformation at Storyful. Nathan relies on CrowdTangle in his research into election disinformation, hate speech, and extremism, and has expressed frustration with the limitations of Meta's supposed replacement for CrowdTangle, the Meta Content Library. And lastly, Pri Bengani is the Tao Computational Journalism Fellow at the Tao Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia University and studies partisan local news and the intersection of platform companies with the media. Pri wrote an influential 4-part series on deceptive online local news sites and the ethics of social platforms and content moderation. Thank you all so much for being here today. I would love to start with a scene-setting question. We have a very kind of wide-ranging audience on the call today, representing private sector, nonprofit, civil society, government, research, academia, and members of the public that are curious about this. So for that kind of audience in mind, who maybe haven't been following the issue closely or have, can you please share 2 things to each panelist? One is a way that CrowdTangle has been indispensable to you or your organization. And 2, what are you most worried about with its closure? We'll start with you, Davey.
Hi, everyone. This topic is extremely important. And I think, CrowdTangle, it's a bit of an inside baseball, maybe issue to some folks, but it's so indispensable to the work that we do. I can't overstate the usefulness of this tool to my own reporting. I've written probably dozens of stories about false and damaging narratives, including with real-world consequences using CrowdTangle. And I think it's important to note that, in this age of polarization where there's this portrayal that misinformation is just, stories that an institution or one side doesn't like, that CrowdTangle enables reporters like myself to be able to back up our stories with data. And that's just of primary importance, especially ahead of a very important election. There are workarounds to getting data and doing stories using other tools, but they pale in comparison to what we have been able to do with CrowdTangle. And to have the authority to say that we have used a tool that plugs right into the back end of a major social media platform has been so essential. It will make our work more difficult to do ahead of the US election, to have this tool be shut down at this time, and would love to just keep the conversation going and raise awareness about this. and happy to elaborate on any of those points.
Thank you. Nathan, you're perhaps our most tactical user of CrowdTangle in this group. You and Davey maybe, but we'd love to hear from you on this.
Sure, and thanks for having me. This is a really important conversation. I'd say in terms of like ISD, how we use CrowdTangle, really it's our go-to research tool for just about everything Facebook and Instagram. So we'll use it to track things like emerging trends, emerging narratives, key actors, what they're up to, and so on. I can continue and continue. I would say it's something that's especially useful for our non-technical staff to be able to do data analysis. I think for years it's really been the gold standard of that kind of thing. And then we also have it integrated, like it's API integrated in numerous work streams. So we can just kind of like automated collect data over the course of months and even years, looking at things like tracking trends in extremism and hate speech and stuff like that. Our research really is for the public and for policymakers, looking at things like disinformation and extremism, and that's looking across platforms where Facebook and Instagram really fits in as a key role in some countries. We also have accountability focused projects. So these are ones that are aimed at, pressuring Meta over some of its potential harms. Well, that's going to be something that becomes a bit more difficult to do as we lose some of the access we previously had. No, I think some of that is like also a bit theoretical. It's probably going to be a bit difficult for, I don't know, non-researchers to make sense of some of this. So like just as an example, a recent project we did was look at how the news ban in Canada. So Meta banned the news or like sharing of news websites in Canada in response to a sort of like legal challenge that was going on there. Basically just to avoid having to pay news publishers for their content. And we wanted to like look at how that impacted the quality of news that was getting shared on Facebook in particular, and we found a demonstrable impact there. But it's just like an example of like how we looked at this and some of the differences between the meta content library, the MCL and CrowdTangle. We wanted to look at like, we'll say like reputable news outlets, New York Times, BBC, so on and so forth, and see how shares of those compared to shares of maybe like these, I don't know, jankier third tier kind of websites on Facebook. So these are ones that like I hadn't really even heard of a whole lot. And the only way to do that is, of course, when you have the data of news that was getting shared, to pull open the Facebook posts and see, is this URL getting blocked or is it not? And we would see basically outlets like the New York Times were disproportionately getting blocked, and ones like these, jankier sites that you probably haven't even heard of were being left untouched. Well, that was only possible by opening these URLs. And I will say like in the meta content library, that's not going to be possible. And in CrowdTangle, that was. That's just one of, I don't know, a dozen changes like that are that we're going to be expecting. So just sort of like a challenge there. Sorry, there's a second point to your question. It was about like, what are we most worried about? And I think, it's nothing like in particular. There are like dozens of issues I have with this. It's maybe just like everything collectively is painting a picture of diminished access, diminished usability for especially our non-technical staff. That's something that we're seeing across platforms, this sort of like reduction in data access. And I don't know, it's just sort of like a big broader concern I have that this is happening across platforms, it's happening with X, it's happening with Reddit. So this sort of like stifling of our research is something that we're really concerned about and looking to take action on.
Thank you. That was a great overview. Brandy, you have a more unique perspective here in that you lead a coalition of people who are using this to do really important research. What is your kind of high-level view of this issue based on where you sit?
Sure. Thanks, Megan. As you mentioned, I lead a coalition of more than 400 researchers, including journalists, civil society actors, academics, as well as 50 research institutions who are part of the coalition, and use CrowdTangle for a variety of purposes. So it's really an invaluable tool for organizations and individuals who are doing disinformation research or monitoring political communication online, studying topics like online harassment and hate speech, especially when there's a gendered aspect to that, and it translates into online violence and more. I want to lift up one specific example from an organization called #Generation, which works to stop anti-minority disinformation and hate speech on Facebook that has resulted in community violence in Sri Lanka. So they map harmful content and track it to the original actors and networks in order to support preemptive regulation that stops such posts or helps to mitigate their spread. And so they share their research with other civil society organizations, with UN agencies and international organizations, as well as regulators. And unfortunately, none of that work is going to be possible anymore without CrowdTangle. And I learned of this example from a survey that we ran of researchers in the coalition and also as part of the broader research community, which found that 88% of the researchers who we surveyed said that they're extremely concerned about their ability to continue their work after CrowdTangle's shutdown. So that's obviously a piece that I'm incredibly concerned about. But I think similar to Nathan, my bigger concern is when you zoom out, it's really what this signals for the state of corporate accountability and transparency. So in arguably the largest global election year ever, the fact that a company can signal their intention to make such a decision and then have such a groundswell of opposition from civil society all around the globe, from lawmakers in the United States and Europe, from journalists, you name it, and continue to go ahead with this decision and not really respond to any of that criticism. That's what I think is the bigger worrying piece when you kind of zoom out and look at the bigger picture.
Thank you, Brandy. Pri, over to you. You sit in an academic space when it comes to these issues, really unlike the rest of the panel and unlike myself. What is your perspective on that kind of and the importance of academia in this conversation and access for academics?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think the heart of the matter goes to the fact that the meta content library, which is being touted as the CrowdTangle replacement, doesn't have half the features that CrowdTangle has. And the fact that Facebook or Meta are willing to shut down something that's working, that's functioning, and even if, we were to take them at the word that it's aging infrastructure that needs to be, shut down eventually, shutting it down at this point in time seems to be a deliberate choice, and especially when the meta content library just isn't there yet. And kind of continuing off what Brandy was saying, we do have a problem now where you're going to have individual countries that are going to put laws in place, and then you're just going to have transparency in specific countries, specific parts of the world, but not in the others. And so now you have this weird fragmented transparency ecosystem, which just makes tracking trends or research across geographies incredibly hard. And then kind of like looking at it more from an academic standpoint, I think there are a couple of things that are worth mentioning. One is, even for academics, getting access to the content library is hard. It has to be tied to a specific project. So if we want to do ongoing monitoring, if we want to do something that's more expansive, it becomes much harder to do. And there needs to be an IRB approval, which is the review board. And while I'm a big fan of the IRB, one of the things that's true at Columbia, at least, is that the IRB is overseen by the medical school. And so for social media research to kind of have the same, have the medical school overseeing that IRB, it makes it really hard because we're really comparing apples and oranges here when we're trying to do social media research versus actual harms in the medical community. And yeah, so which is why it's just, and then also I work really closely with journalists, and journalists not having access just makes it much harder for them to do their job as well.
Thank you so much. So much of what we've heard so far has been around access issues and the barriers and the friction to getting access to the new tool. And that kind of assumes that everyone here that is using the tool, whether on this call or with existing access to CrowdTangle, will actually get access to the new tool, right? Which is actually a question mark. And in some cases, in the case of Davey and for-profit journalism, Meta has actually outright stated that for-profit journalists will not be granted access to the replacement, the Meta content library. We go into some of the other sort of differences in our letter that CAP and the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, Nathan's organization, co-authored to Meta back this summer. But Davey, tell us more about the implication to not just you, but to for-profit journalism in such a crucial time. And there's already kind of a question around the role of technology in journalism, and this feels like it just kind of further degrades that. And so how are you thinking about the future without access and without any path to getting access?
It's a good question, and I think this gets to the heart of the issues that we're discussing here. We don't have a plan, in short. I've spoken, I sort of flicked at our ability to access some workarounds to continue our reporting. And we're absolutely committed to doing that and continuing to report on social media and misinformation. This makes it that much harder to do that. So to be more specific, for instance, on X, formerly known as Twitter, the social platform has posted something called Community Notes, which is a crowdsourced database of volunteers who write notes appended on mostly viral posts, correcting them, and you're able to download that database. So we've, for instance, used that to investigate Twitter. And there are some other workarounds. We partner with groups that have access to the sort of APIs of these platforms. But again, and I mentioned this before, the fact that CrowdTangle was a Facebook-owned tool and data is so central to the reporting that we do, and being able to back up our reporting with actual data to show that these things are actually happening and we can tell you specific numbers, specific views, that has been so essential to writing our stories. So, I would love to hear from the other panelists sort of what the difference is between CrowdTangle and the Meta content library, because I simply have not been able to play around with it. I haven't had access to it. And it's a big kind of open question for us how we will continue forward as we cover the election. We'll try our best, but this is making a dent in our work for sure.
Thank you for that, Davey. And you actually teed up my question for Nathan very, very perfectly, which is that unlike many CrowdTangle users who won't get access to the replacement, your team likely will, or maybe already has had some access to a pilot version of the content library. But naturally, there would be a disruption to your research, I would guess, during the transition and with some of those limitations. So first, what are some of those limitations that you kind of are like tactically noticing? And then what challenges does that pose to your research on disinfo, violent discourse, and hate speech, especially leading up to the election? For example, how would you go about tracking online discourse about the potential for political violence leading up to November?
Great. Yeah, great question. I would just emphasize it would be incredibly disruptive for us. I mean, we don't actually have full access yet to the MCL. We're expecting probably to go weeks, maybe even longer, without any kind of access to that. I will say I alluded to this earlier, we have like a set of infrastructures built off CrowdTangle. These are going to need to be rebuilt. I don't think the Meta content library is quite fully developed yet. It seems like constantly there's like new changes that are being implemented and all that. So typically when a product like CrowdTangle is sunset, its replacement, I think, as somebody noted in the chat, is has been like fully developed. So what I'd say is basically there's going to be a flat line of our collection in some work streams, and it's going to be really painful to recreate these. I think especially around like extremism, where we're tracking this based on accounts rather than just like keyword searches. That's going to be quite difficult for us. And part of that is that with CrowdTangle, you could just like upload a list of accounts that you're interested in. In the MCL, you're going to have to manually do these, and that's going to be, hours and hours of work for us. In terms of a difference, I mean, there's quite a few. But when you talk about what was it, political violence ahead of the U.S. election, I would say a lot of like the most like violent accounts, the most like toxic, hateful, extremist sorts of accounts are typically smaller size in terms of like their followers and stuff like that. The MCL is not going to be pulling data, as I understand it, from these smaller sorts of accounts. I think it's under 15,000 followers you need to have for like profiles, verified profiles, and 25,000 for accounts. So that's going to mean we end up missing a lot of the most, I don't know, for us, important sources of information. And then in terms of further like the disruption, we're not going to have access for likely the next couple of weeks. We have the DNC coming up. I think we're going to have to looking at other platforms for that, which in some cases is a bit of a problem, as certain kind of issue sets lend themselves more toward Facebook and Instagram. And I think especially in other geographies where Facebook in some cases is the de facto most used by far social platform, that's going to be a big issue.
Thank you, Nathan. We've seen in the EU, where the Digital Services Act is active and sort of effectively in law, and has been for some time now, some regulatory response to this issue. And I kind of opened with this, but in the EU, earlier this year, they did begin formal proceedings, official proceedings, to determine whether or not Meta actually breached the Digital Services Act, in part due to the dissolution of CrowdTangle without what they deemed was an adequate replacement. Similarly, in the US, we saw Senator Coons speak about his letter that 17 members of the House and the Senate on both sides of the aisle signed on to. So there is a bipartisan response and a regulatory response that we have seen sort of happening around the world. Brandy, maybe over to you. Why is this an urgent political issue? And in absence of a DSA style regulation in the US, where we don't have anything, we have a couple things proposed. What can we glean from the example going on in the EU with their official proceedings, and how they're thinking about Meta's walk back on transparency?
Yeah, sure. It's an urgent political issue because in an election year, especially an election year like this one, it's super critical for the public to be able to understand how political campaigns, how politicians and other actors are messaging to people on social media, first and foremost. And aside from official parties and candidates, election times are just often hyper political moments in society. And those moments, no matter what the topic or where, call for more oversight and more scrutiny of information environments and not less. And so what we're seeing is this rollback of transparency at precisely the moment when we need it more than ever, because the ability for lies and rumors to spread like wildfire on social media can really lead to real world offline violence, as we've seen in the United States and we've seen elsewhere. So that's why it's an urgent political issue, and I'm happy to see that it's being taken seriously as such. I think with regard to what we can learn from the EU, I mean, just today we saw, in response to the European Commission, their initial findings with regard to TikTok and TikTok's potential breach of the Digital Services Act, we saw TikTok permanently commit to permanently withdrawing TikTok Lite from the market in all throughout Europe as a result of the DSA. And so I think that that is an example of the power that the DSA has brought in terms of being able to really hold companies accountable for their actions in line with the regulation that exists. And so obviously the commission is still in the process of investigating, and those proceedings can take some time. But from where I sit, it honestly feels like the only point of leverage that we have. Again, I just want to reiterate the groundswell of calls from so many different people for Meta to change their mind on this, and it hasn't worked. And so when you have that level of public campaigning over an online transparency tool, which is something I'm happy to see, but I never thought that I would see just a few years ago, and you still have the company taking absolutely no action in response, it really shows why regulation can be so powerful in this space as it relates to accountability of social media platforms.
Thank you. I will come back to more on the kind of the policy side of this. Pri, I'd love to turn to you. You have written and thought about in your kind of academic career content moderation practices inside the companies, and in the sort of past, I would say, 2-ish years since really Elon Musk took over Twitter, we've seen a very clear degradation of sort of the integrity of tech companies internally and externally, including with layoffs, with walking back election denial policies, with things like shutting down CrowdTangle. And the internal kind of mirror of that is changes to how they do content moderation, resources they allocate towards content moderation, and sort of practices around that. If you can share any insights into kind of your research there and how we may extrapolate learnings for this moment we're in with CrowdTangle.
Yeah, it's I think Nathan touched on this as well earlier, that you really do have platforms taking a step back from transparency. And I think we are almost at a point where it's worse than what it was in 2016 right now. Because, at least in 2016, we had the Twitter API, we had the Reddit API. And then if you look at the internal stats, and I was looking at this earlier, it's like Twitter's trust and safety has apparently gone down by over 40% since Musk took over Twitter. But even like the smaller platforms, be it Snapchat, be it Discord, their trust and safety teams have also reduced by, 20 to 30%. For years, and I mean, to be honest, this is much more Davey's domain than mine, but for years, journalists have kind of been finding some of the most toxic, some of the most awful things on the platforms. And what the platforms end up doing is play whack-a-mole. So what they're doing is effectively finding one item, okay, we've whacked that, but like 15, 20 other instances of that continue to exist. And like we did research on that a couple of years back on Facebook specifically, which is when we had used CrowdTangle to see, hey, to what extent is Facebook consistent in applying its own, Facebook has partnerships with fact checkers that they have partnerships with label a piece of content as, false or misleading or something. So to what extent does that get applied to all instances of the same content? And the answer is that not very often. And so in the absence of the automated tools being good enough, and in the absence of tools that make the lives of academics and journalists easier to just even to help flag stuff to Facebook, right? You're just kind of living in a really weird environment where it's like, does Facebook or not even just Facebook, the platforms just not really care about what's on their platform as long as they're getting the ad money.
Yeah, that resonates heavily with me as well. I spent a number of years at the platforms on various teams, including doing kind of crisis management related to external events, and the amount of kind of whack-a-mole style games that we would play with a video or a post or some specific kind of violating or harmful content. The problem of scale, I think, is cannot be overstated with this. And, I think there is some good intent to tackle these problems, but the problem of scale will continue to mean that tools like CrowdTangle are really, really critical to understanding and gleaning insights and trends across a whole bunch of content, because we know that a single piece or one profile or whatever the case is can go up or come down, but that doesn't really change kind of the overall harm profile. One more question for you all, and then I'm gonna pull from the audience questions. We're in this moment, we're 48 hours from closure. We have some proceedings happening in the EU. Some people get access to the new thing, some people don't. What else is needed here? We have conversations like this, uplifting this issue, continuing this important work. Maybe it's a political response, maybe it's a tactical response. What are some other ideas for things that we should be kind of putting on the table as options for the way forward? Anyone can answer.
I think one thing important as a helpful way forward is collaboration to work around this. I think in a lot of cases, I've been a bit confused. I think organizations like mine have been confused. What's happening, how to deal with it. So just that kind of collaboration, I think, is needed, especially as some organizations see disruption. Some organizations can't get access. Is there a way for, Davey and journalists like her to be able to continue on with their important work without being able to access this tool? Not 100%, but something like that, I think, is a needed way forward.
Yeah, I can jump in on that too. I think this issue of monitoring the rhetoric on social media platforms is a group effort in a lot of ways. It's about the public raising media literacy levels. It's about academics and civil society groups and coalitions like Brandy's all working together to make sure that we understand the dynamics of these platforms and can elucidate that for the public and tell the stories that are the most urgent and pressing. One thing that I would love to see from the platforms is, especially after the 2016 presidential election, in which there was evidence of foreign interference on social media, it appeared like the platforms kind of had renewed commitment to transparency. And, there were many, many years after that of them reiterating that commitment. I want to know that that was not just sort of in response to the events of the day, but that was a real sentiment. And I think I would just hope to see the continuation of those stated commitments, and to listen to the communities that are coming forward to shine a light on this issue.
Thank you. Great. Oh, Brandy. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just to add, I just want to add a few things. I think that the need for, we've been talking mainly about CrowdTangle and about other kind of official tools that can be used to study social media platforms. I think as it relates to the way forward and what else is needed, I think greater protections for public interest researchers who scrape data is really key as well. That is a very, very dicey area, and it's one that urgently needs attention as part of the conversation about social media data access. I also think that, I've said a couple of times that it is a bit wild that we're having a conversation largely about software that's developed by companies themselves when we're talking about something so critical as transparency over our information ecosystem. And so I think that there's a real need from the civil society side to kind of have this conversation on our own terms. So rather than just debating, oh, is meta content library more sufficient than CrowdTangle, we need to be affirmatively putting forward what good transparency looks like and demanding that. And then I suppose a question or something, really an idea that's been floating around in my mind as it relates to the power dynamics, because it feels like transparency is often a losing game, trying to get transparency from corporations. Kind of, Davey, to the point that you raised about it maybe being a moment in time and a response to something. I've been thinking a lot about what it would take and what it would look like to make transparency considered to be an essential business function of a platform company in the same way that, say, security is considered an essential business function a lot of the time. And what would that look like from civil society? What kind of research, what kind of investigations might elevate that to a particular level? Or is it political action that's needed? I don't have the answer to that, but I want to raise it as something that I've been thinking about lately in terms of what could potentially change the game on transparency.
Thank you. We will move to audience questions. I have a few here, and then if others think of them in the audience, please use the Q&A function. And this is directed at anyone on the panel. This move by Meta coincides with Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter in 2022, now X, in which he fired many of the trust and safety and disinformation protection teams. How do you see autocratic states like Russia and China using the collapse of some of these functions in the company and in the sector at large to push specific influence agendas against American voters? Will such campaigns be more effective now as a result of this decision by Meta?
I can say with these sorts of foreign influence campaigns, probably like the biggest thing about them is to keep tabs on them. Otherwise, as we see, they can start to flourish. So as like data access, I think, dries up a bit, it becomes a lot more difficult in some cases to identify this kind of stuff and then, you know, reactively deal with it. So yeah, I would say absolutely this is likely to have an implication on this, as a lot of like what we've seen in the past, the organizations calling this stuff out and identifying it and Meta dealing with it has been done through this kind of exact sort of data access.
Thank you. Combining a couple questions here, what kind of reasons did Meta offer for sunsetting CrowdTangle? Who all was involved in Meta's decision to shut down CrowdTangle? What about the board, the oversight board? Have there been efforts to mobilize institutional investors around this urgent issue? Nathan, I know you touched a little bit about kind of confusion on this issue. You know, maybe Brandy or really anyone want to chime in into what you've been told is the reason. I've been told a few things. I'm happy to share those as well, but definitely want to hear from you all. And then any efforts you've made to kind of reach the source.
I can jump in because we've reported on this issue a bit. And in our reporting, well, first of all, I'll back up and say that publicly Meta says that CrowdTangle is a degrading tool, and that, you know, the infrastructure needed to keep it up is sort of outpacing its capacity, which, you know, you can take Meta at its word on that, and we don't have specific insight into what those particular infrastructure problems are. But I will say that, you know, when we have reported on CrowdTangle and the teams developing features, we've heard of, you know, product roadmaps that were coming down the pike. Things like image searches, being able to match images across Facebook, being able to reverse image search some of these sort of viral memes. And in one case, a grant that Meta's CrowdTangle team was going to give to a research group that comes up with a project that sort of sheds light on some platform dynamics within the company, within the platform. That grant was rescinded, and some of the features that we were told to expect just never materialized. And so if there was, some of these resources and plans being laid out, and then that was taken away, I think that maybe points to shifting priorities rather than necessarily an issue that is about Meta's commitment to putting more resources into the tool. So I think this is a question that we need to press Meta on, and I'd like to see continued reporting on it.
Yeah, I just want to add to the degrading tool point. I was quite caught off guard actually by that comment, because if right now, if you go to crowdtangle.com, you'll see a bunch of case studies that were published by Meta's own team highlighting the amazing impact that this tool has had and all of the great things that it's allowed newsrooms, including newsrooms, I believe, who they are kicking off of or not making eligible to have access to the new tool, who won't be able to have access anymore. And so it really, I think, is an example of the company changing their narrative in order to fit a decision that, perhaps transparency has become too politically contentious for the company to stomach. I don't know what one could speculate, but I think what I do see is dishonesty with regard to the way that they are publicly messaging it, in comparison to the ways that I think even in the last election cycle, they were training political parties, training NGOs on how to use this tool to do really good election monitoring work around the election. So it seems very much a bait and switch, I suppose.
Go ahead.
If I could just quickly jump in one last point here. I think part of the justification, maybe not for just the decision, but some of the micro decisions that Meta's made around how the MCO will get implemented. So the certain features that they're taking out or adding and stuff like that, I've understood to be around privacy related concerns. The only point I would put on that is in some cases, I don't necessarily maybe agree with it, but I can at least see the argument there. But there's numerous features that are going to be lost that have nothing to do with privacy. So there's this thing called an intelligence tab that allows users to do sorts of data analysis without having technical skills. That's really important. Nothing to do with privacy. Being able to share dashboards, that's something like ISD, an organization that's very collaborative. We do this all the time. We've done this dozens and dozens of projects. Limiting access to organizations like Bloomberg. Not sure where the privacy component is there. And then there's others that are a bit smaller too, saving posts that I don't need to get into every little change that's being lost. But that's something I just wanted to highlight as well.
This next question is surrounding PATA, the Platform Accountability and Transparency Act, which Senator Coons mentioned in his opening remarks. In their bipartisan letter to Mark Zuckerberg, urging for an extension of CrowdTangle, the 17 members of Congress noted their support for PATA. And in it, it says, among other things, would require platforms to offer a tool similar to CrowdTangle. Brandy, you touched on this a little bit, but I would love to kind of go a little deeper with everyone. What other tactical methods of transparency do you believe Congress or any sort of regulatory body around the world, or maybe not even in the form of regulation, but what transparency methods should be implemented?
Yeah, that's a big question. It's probably a bigger question than we have time to fully go into on the panel, but I think that transparency protections or transparency provisions that enable a wide array I'll explain some of the basic principles that I believe in, which I think is transparency should benefit the many and not the few. So we too often see transparency provisions being implemented, which are really only able to be leveraged by academic researchers or people with a very strong technical background. So one of the reasons why CrowdTangle was such a beloved tool by so many is that it was often considered, and many features of it, usable by even a novice, even somebody who doesn't necessarily know how to code or doesn't have a strong background in data analytics or otherwise. So I think that is very important in terms of thinking about what good transparency provisions look like. Those that are available to a wide array of researchers, including journalists critically, as well as thinking about different research methods that researchers use and making sure that transparency provisions allow for a full array of those. So CrowdTangle obviously was upheld as one of the kind of gold standards of transparency, but I already mentioned also scraping protections for researchers who scrape data. And that is another really critical piece that I think that transparency provisions should entail. So yeah, they should be, I think, designed for a wide variety of cases. And also I think it's important to say to be flexible into the future as well. Like, I don't think that any of us, I don't know, 15 years ago would have thought, okay, video is going to be the main thing that we're analyzing. So how are we thinking? And still today, not as many people. I mean, there are far fewer tools to do analysis of YouTube, for instance, and to actually process like video is incredibly difficult and incredibly expensive. So also thinking about the ways in which these provisions should be designed for kind of future purposes as well. So it's a very tricky area. So I tend to think about what are kind of the principles that such provisions should include.
Just one thing to kind of like add to that is the way the MCL works in terms of the way you get access to it is if you want access, you have to say what you want to do, and then Meta provides it to you, ideally. I guess that makes me a little bit uncomfortable in that we are required to get access directly from Meta, and if they don't like our proposal for whatever reason, then feasibly they can reject it. So it kind of makes me wonder how independent we can be as an organization if we are dependent on Meta to agree to whatever we want to research. So yeah, I don't know. I think that's like probably the biggest thing I want to add there.
Just to quickly piggyback off on that, the other thing, which is kind of also goes to the, Meta overseeing or having some kind of oversight into what the research actually is. If you're trying to do computational analysis on the MCL as opposed to downloading specific bits of data or just browsing, you have to be on Facebook's VPN. You can't do it outside that, which effectively basically means that if you're using your primary research computer to access the clean room, as it were, Facebook also has insight into all your other network activity, which just seems a little bit over the top.
I'll add, just going back to CrowdTangle, since that's what we started with. I think one of the things that made the tool so powerful is that it really was so easy to use, even for basic users and essentially anyone who's been on Facebook. And the insights that you were able to glean from the tool, you could present those insights as here's what we found, here's the data, here's how we did it, it's replicable, you can do it yourself. So you don't actually have to take our word for it if you don't trust us as an institution. It's at your fingertips. And I think that's an important part of what we're losing here in the age of sort of eroding trust in news institutions and academic institutions, and sort of skepticism around what is misinformation, what are false narratives. This has been an incredibly powerful tool to just sort of show what is happening on these social media platforms. And I think that's something that we'll have to struggle to replace. Hopefully we can cobble together again some workarounds, and we will again continue to keep reporting on this. But there is a loss here that I think we all need to be aware of.
Thank you all. That was very, very insightful to hear from each of you. I think zooming out from just CrowdTangle and the meta content library, which definitely present their own set of issues, transparency is critical for so many reasons. But one thing I would just kind of add on as we all wrap up is that as we think about the importance of protecting kids online or protecting journalists and researchers to do third-party research in a safe way, or to uphold the value of privacy for Americans, any sort of, even the artificial intelligence conversation, which of course is robust all around the tech space, any of these kind of tech issues as we think about them in isolation, the efficacy of them and the ability to measure how well they are or not sort of working, transparency is absolutely critical into doing that. And so in isolation, a single law regulating artificial intelligence or a single grant that gives researchers access to an API is helpful, but with the umbrella of transparency kind of over it. And so as we think about the tech landscape at large, I would just offer that kind of parting thought, which is it's not just CrowdTangle, it's not just PATA, it's not just a privacy bill, it's kind of all of these things together as we kind of go out into the world and continue to advance all of our different issues. So with that, thank you all so very much. And I hope everyone has a great week. Thanks for joining us.